The moderator will be Marko from Binary Builders. We have Noah from NodeKit, Stan from Initia, Kevin from Nitro Labs, and Christian from Primev. Welcome, guys. A little bit of an applause, please.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming and watching. I think we have more people than L2s in the crowd, so that's a good sign. So let's start with a quick round of intros. What's your project? Are you decentralized? Are you using a sequencer?
Yeah, so glad to kick this off. So at NodeKit, we're building the first composability layer to unlock synchronous communication across rollups. And the way that we do that is we have a shared sequencer called Seek, and this specialized block builder called Javelin, which is the first super builder. So we're able to enable essentially instant communication across different L2s, allowing for single block bridging and single block communication. So that's NodeKit.
So I'm at Primev. We are building a network for pre-confirmations on Ethereum. So we are more like on an infrastructure level for L2, so we don't really have sequencer in that sense, right? But we do have also a chain to settle the pre-confirmation. So for this, we also have a chain. And so there we currently just have one kind of sequencer in a sense, but it's not a sequencer in a roll-up sense. It's just like sidechain more or less. So yeah, that's basically kind of a different angle. So we are not trying to innovate on kind of having the best state-of-the-art sequencing technology, but more like providing infrastructure.
Cool. Hi, my name is Stan from Initia. Basically, Initia is a network for interwoven rollups. What we try to do is make launching an application on a new rollup very easy, and really thinking about the multi-chain experience, how assets and I guess like users should be moving around a world that's getting increasingly fragmented or modular. So we allow teams to basically do a lot of that kind of stuff, and then as well as allow users to interact with multiple applications without having to think about like, I'm going to bridge from one L1 to another L1 to an L2, etc. Abstracting a lot of the UI UX pieces as well. And given the fact that we are like a hybrid L1 L2 system where there are multiple L2s, we obviously have sequencers for these L2s, and the sequencers can be ranging from centralized to decentralized. I guess that's a little bit about Initia.
Hey, I'm Kevin. I just came on as the COO of Nitro Labs. And last Friday, we announced coming out of stealth with our first product called Termina. We're the first SVM cloud, or first Solana virtual machine cloud. And our focus here is to build customizable Solana block space anywhere in minutes. Currently, it's very challenging to actually take out the SVM out of the vertically integrated stack of that is the L1 of Solana. So we're really focused on basically creating a module for the SVM called SVM Plus in order to create customizable space for builders to be able to build really interesting killer applications on top of the top of the Solana stack elsewhere. So this could be rollups, this could be app chains. Our testnet will be coming out, our devnet will be coming out in the near future. And in our current architecture, we are utilizing a centralized sequencer. However, with our vision of building out a SVM cloud, it will enable builders around the world to be able to use any sort of architecture that they want for a sequencer. So hence we're on this chat. So thanks for having us.
Amazing. So, I mean, you guys touched on your sequencers. In today's landscape, I know the title is shared and decentralized, but kind of taking a step back and looking at the current landscape, like everything is centralized. It's all centralized sequencers. Do you guys see that as a problem? Do we need decentralized sequencers?
I guess.
Oh, everyone raised their mic. This is a good one.
Yeah, so I think there's trade-offs. I wouldn't say one is good and one is bad. I think it really depends on the use case, right? So like there's teams that use centralized sequencers. One, just for like when they first launch, you probably want to be stable. You probably want to reduce the number of like external dependencies and things that you're, I guess, like dependent on. The second like reason you may want something like this is because like when there's multiple sequencers or like multiple parties involved in any sort of transaction, you have some sort of like P2P problem where you have some sort of latency, some sort of problems with communication with each other. And so that necessarily makes things a little bit slower, a little bit more complicated. On the opposite side, you might have like decentralized sequencers, and I think that's really good in terms of like allowing anybody to join, having like a very low barrier of entry. But like obviously, for example, like Comet BFT, things like that, they have like very large, basically P2P problems. So I think it's just like a trade-off that you need to make when you're like an app builder or like a chain builder or like whatever type of builder you are.
Yeah, I'll chime in there as well. I don't really think it's an issue currently. I think that we need to build for what users want, and users want fast and cheap. It seems like currently with centralized sequencers, like Optimism or Arbitrum, for a while they didn't really have fraud proofs. People still utilize them, and that's because they were able to do things on chain. I think that we should focus on building for users, and therefore, currently, centralized sequencers are okay. But that being said, as users get more intelligent around how we're utilizing block space, I think that there's a way larger design space for interesting things, and you're actually able to build things in the app layer that is actually like kind of what these users want and like what they value. And a lot of those users may actually value more decentralization. Therefore, over time, I think it becomes more valuable.
Yeah, the way I look at it is if we are going to be centralized in every single aspect of crypto, we're really no better than traditional finance. Because if we have a single centralized entity which can be censored by some large government entity, then there's nothing stopping the US government, Chinese government, or any of these large governing bodies that have shown that they want to have regulatory overreach in either crypto privacy or the internet at large from coming in and essentially stopping transfers out from these different sequencers, shutting companies down, and locking in users' funds potentially. Even with these systems being essentially progressively decentralized, I do think decentralization is something that's core to crypto, and it's one of the reasons I got into crypto. And I don't think that this traditional state of today where people are pairing centralization with large sequencer profits is necessarily, you can have both essentially. So you can have decentralized essentially nodes that essentially are able to settle the different blocks with different rollups and essentially batch these transactions. And you can decentralize out on that side and still leverage sequencers in a way where you're not necessarily having to split up all your revenue across a network of 200 nodes. You can have a network of between 10 to 20 to a smaller network of nodes and still have the advantages of decentralization. I think a lot of people view it as you either go all the way at the spectrum of a large decentralized network of nodes for sequencers, somewhere like an L1 like Solana, or you have one centralized entity, and that's just not the case. So I think that rollups should aim to decentralize to provide a better user experience because users only care about censorship when it affects them, and by the time it affects them, it'll be too late.
Yeah, definitely agree with that. It's why we got into this space. Definitely honing in on the point of building for users. This week has been a lot of infra. From this week and everything that's building, like how do you guys see the space evolving? And I think this can kind of go into where do we see the sequencer world moving to?
I mean, one thing that people talk a lot about is now this based roll-up space, right? That is one way to basically decentralize the sequencer in the maximum possible way, right? We say, what's the most decentralized set of entities we have? That's kind of the Ethereum L1 validator, so we can take these people to become our sequencers. So I think that is a very bold step towards like decentralizing roll-ups, and that gets a lot of attention here.
Yeah, I think this base roll-up approach is quite interesting. However, I still think there's a new design space around how do you make it fast and cheap for users to like basically use. And what I mean by that is like it's another layer of abstraction in order for users to sign into a front end and want to use something that's high performant. Given that a lot of teams are going to want to use Ethereum as the base rollup, and that's going to lead to 12-second slot time. And you have innovators like here that are going to be working on things like pre-configs and safe configs, and that's additionally just optimizations in order to make things fast and cheap. So I think Don Char, like I don't really know how to pronounce his last name, it's kind of challenging. He kind of mentions that we're all building the same thing, and I think in that case, it's another kind of interesting design space for infrastructure for us to all build something that can potentially help the kind of, let's say, consumer app builders build a killer app. So I think while it's interesting, I think that we're still very early on into what that design space looks like and how we can build things for end users.
I actually think like for sequencers, you have like researchers and people looking into different types of sequencing, different types of ways to do this like P2P problem, all this like more, I guess, stuff related to research rather than like the actual the applications. And I think it's important to do this type of like more pure research. I actually think like the landscape of sequencers will probably borrow a lot of these new concepts, a lot of this new research, but in the end, I think it's the applications that really drive like the landscape of sequencers, right? Like you see different applications like DYDX, Hyperliquid, they choose stuff that you would consider a little bit more centralized in some sense. And there's reasons for doing so, and I think like, spinning up your own chain, choosing your sequencers, I think the sequencer is a very important part of like the economic stack and the value that your application is capturing. If you have an application that's valuable, like you probably want to capture that value, right? And I think from the product's perspective or like the product team's perspective, they may value capturing that additional economic value more so than like, decentralization or whatever. So I think like a lot of the landscape with regards to sequencers will actually be decided by the successful applications themselves that eventually move up to rollups rather than like, centralized, or rather than like sequencing research itself.
Yeah. No, I tend to agree on that side. What we've seen on like the customer side is the main concerns, the main things that rollups are looking for when they're looking to decentralize their sequencer is they're concerned about two things. They're concerned about liquidity fragmentation across all these different L2s and trying to solve that problem. And then they're concerned about, are we going to lose out on sequencing revenue, on MEV revenue? And with the current solutions on the market, a lot of the current solutions don't solve for that, even if you're decentralized out on your sequencer. We've really focused on, at NodeKit, really building out a solution that allows you to continue monetizing your own block space while benefiting from cross-rollup transactions. And I think that over time, we're going to see kind of this bifurcation of shared sequencers that benefit L2s, joining them tremendously more so than they benefit from running something themselves, will essentially win out versus L2s trying to roll their whole stack essentially from scratch. Because we've already seen it with essentially app chains as well, where most app chains are building on existing stacks because it's more beneficial for them to have these benefits from building on stacks such as Cosmos SDK than it is for them to roll their own stack from scratch. So I think we're going to see the same thing play out with regards to shared sequencers versus trying to roll your own decentralized sequencer from scratch.
Yeah, I would say Noah and Stan have great points here, where like our core focus at Termina is to really build out this modular stack for the SVM in order to abstract away these type of things. So builders can build things with decentralized sequencers in the future, as well as utilize the SVM, which is, I would say, the largest alternative developer base right now, with a more performant execution layer in order to build things like app chains as well as rollups with killer applications that can actually benefit from these type of things. And in that way, they can then decide what type of sequencer and what type of sequencer architecture actually works for them in order to kind of capture this value while also not having to worry about the protocol engineering. They can actually just focus on building out the smart contracts in the application, and that way they all benefit, and they benefit from these type of things as well, like such as decentralized sequencers or shared sequencers, and they can decide on these type of the type of security affordances that like benefit their users as well as the way that they want to build these things.
Yeah, I think this all kind of boils down to, if you show us where the incentives are going to lie, that's where the rollups will end up. If they're more incentivized to join a network rather than decentralize their sequencer themselves or have a centralized sequencer, that's where they're going to lie. If they're heavily incentivized to centralize forever and just play the regulatory game, then we're going to see it end up that way. And I think that that's kind of still up for grabs right now, whether or not rollups are more incentivized to try and decentralize to avoid the regulatory overreach, or whether they're more incentivized to keep centralized for now and just play that game with the regulators, essentially.
Yeah, you guys kind of bring up a good point and a good transition into a question that I've been thinking about and people have been talking about this week around, okay, when someone is a sequencer, decentralized, shared, centralized, do you guys think that there will be a point that they'll be like, okay, maybe we want to create our own L1 transition, kind of like what DYDX did. They started on Ethereum, they couldn't do it. They went to StarkX, and then like, we want to decentralize and we want to own the stack. And we wanted consensus for skip connect. And so how do you guys see that evolution, or is it something that people will just stick around with?
Yeah, absolutely. I would love to jump in there. I would say like one of our core theses is that at Nitro Labs and for Termina, which is trying to make the SVM more accessible, is that like all the killer applications in crypto so far have had to have transitioned into rollups and app chains over time, because right now a lot of the current architecture is not scalable. Solana's doing a terrific job of being able to like vertically scale and provide a hyper-performant environment. However, it still deals with like outages and congestion. So a lot of killer applications have gotten significant users, brought in significant liquidity, and then they've realized that they've hit kind of like they've hit a capacity, and then like DYDX, they've transitioned into building out their own stacks and kind of vertically integrating for their core use case, which is like kind of what the overall thesis for Cosmos was over time, which is like a network of app chains, right? So hence we want to kind of be able to expand the pie with what we're building with the SVM cloud at Termina.
I think the general logic when deciding whether or not to build your own chain or like doing whatever is like the risk-reward profile, right? Like the risks of like building your own chain is one, you might have to like bootstrap your validator set, bootstrap liquidity, bootstrap security, etc. Maybe you have some interoperability problems. But the reward is like you're probably able to capture a lot more of that value if you do it correctly, right? And then for the other side, like teams and like products and applications that decide to build on existing infrastructure, use like shared sequencers, etc., is like one, they don't have the expertise, or like it's expensive to do so, etc. Or they like one of the big reasons that people build in Solana is for the community, right? So you're afraid that potentially if I build my application somewhere else, I'm not able to access that community and therefore the liquidity and whatever as well. So I think in general, like applications like DYDX, very successful because they're able to still capture that value and have that community of traders and users, even when they're building their application. Whereas like if you don't think you're able to do something like that, maybe you should be building somewhere else. And I think like those trade-offs are pretty complex and pretty wide across both just infrastructure and like the economic incentives itself. So it's like a little bit difficult to say like, I'm going to choose this for like one singular reason. I think it's like a multitude of reasons.
And so from a technical perspective, if you want to be an L1, you need much more decentralization and security than just if you're like a decentralized sequencer rollup, right? Because if you're a rollup, you're still relying on the L1 for the security, for example, right? I mean, the only thing that can happen basically is that you break liveness if your sequencer set goes down. But if you now have maybe 10 sequencers, right, that's already pretty good for that, right? But having only 10 validators on an L1 would be pretty bad, right? And so now if you want then to really become an L1 with like 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 or more validators, right, then the trade-offs we discussed before with performance is then even kicking in more, right? So you can probably not have an L1 that's as performant as kind of a roll-up with a smaller set of sequences.
I also think you end up having to pay more and more for security, as Dan was saying earlier, and that can really cause a lot of issues around kind of value accrual for these different applications, because you may have a great value accrual mechanism when you are just one application and you are essentially just having to worry about paying a couple sequencers or paying a couple different people on your chain. But when you decentralize that value out, $10 million a year distributed across 200, 300 validators becomes a lot less meaningful than essentially $10 million a year distributed across 3 to 5 sequencers. So I think fundamentally the largest applications will end up going to their own L1, but they also lack the interoperability, the composability that they could benefit from being on a shared network. So I think it really comes down to whether or not they want to be siloed away, and for some applications that makes complete sense, and for some it doesn't. So I think it really depends on like an app-by-app basis.
Makes sense, makes sense. It's definitely, you guys are really honing in on, it's entirely on the product, which is exciting to hear. It's not like we're just building tech in an echo chamber. So kind of, we touched on base sequencing. I'm like a pretty big fan of base sequencing. I think it's actually really cool. But in the world of base sequencing, like in Ethereum, we're coming up with more and more research around how to make the UX better. Pre-confirmations like yourself. Do you guys see like base sequencing being a thing only within Ethereum, or can you also imagine it elsewhere? Like if Initia does base sequencing for its rollups, and for you guys at Nitro, for you guys at NodeKit, like is that an alternative, or do you guys want kind of sequencers to be on their own while communicating to you guys?
The way we view it at NodeKit is essentially we have Seek itself, which is a shared sequencer, but then Javelin is the super builder, so we're able to guarantee atomic execution across chains. We believe that Javelin will be able to participate in different pre-conf marketplaces, different shared sequencers over time. We plan on really opening it up and being able to provide the services to bring composability to all chains, essentially. So from that perspective, we would kind of be interested in participating in different marketplaces on that side. But I do think that pre-confs themselves do really suffer from a coordination problem, because pre-confs have to both lobby the validators of the Ethereum validator set or another validator set to run their sidecar solution. Plus, they need to lobby rollups or other users to leverage their solution, versus a traditional shared sequencer or decentralized sequencer. Decentralized sequencer is typically done by one team, so they don't need to do any lobbying. But for a shared sequencer, they're much more so communicating with different teams on that side. So I think pre-confs themselves face a difficult issue around kind of bootstrapping all different sides of their marketplace, and also incentivizing different participants to use their solution over others. Because currently, with the current solutions for base pre-confs, they're not necessarily economically incentivizing essentially when you're sharing them across a network of rollups. I've yet to see a proposal that's really effectively sharing that revenue across a different network of rollups, essentially. So if I'm a rollup opting in to use base pre-confs, it becomes more difficult to figure out how I have value accrual in the long term. And I do think that's just by nature because we're so early to them. But it will be interesting to see how that plays out for the value accrual side, because rollups fundamentally need value accrual, or they're essentially going to go out of business. So.
I mean, one way this based rollups and preconfs add more value is if you have multiple, right? If you have just one rollup that's based, then maybe that's not super interesting, right? But if you have 10 based rollups, right, and they also have a shared sequencer, right?
Yeah.
And then it's easier, I would say, for different rollups to agree on this shared sequencer set than if you have different marketplaces for different shared sequencers. So you could really have all of Ethereum have the same shared sequencing set, and then you can do like cross-chain synchronous composability stuff and have much better UX and things like that.
You still need to have some specialized kind of builder or proof aggregation layer. Even if you have base sequencing, it doesn't give you synchronous composability by default. That's kind of one of the misconceptions around it. You can't necessarily just have an L1 call. With base sequencing, you can't just call something on a different rollup within the same block unless you have some coordinating mechanism. So base sequencing by itself doesn't necessarily, it gets you there to give you the same trust assumptions, but it doesn't necessarily enable synchronous composability just right off the bat with it. But I do think it does help get a common trust assumption across a different variety of rollups, essentially.
Right, I mean, pre-confirmations together with based rollups would give you this synchronous composability, right?
Pre-confs wouldn't give you synchronous composability. Pre-confs by themselves would just be the same as getting pre-confs from a centralized sequencer. Pre-confs still would need some coordinating body, whether that's a specialized block builder, a solution like the Polygon AG layer. You need something that can be able to guarantee 2 transactions will be going into 2 different blocks and executing across 2 different rollups to be able to achieve synchronous composability in that capacity.
But if you have a shared sequencer, like the L1 proposer sequences 2 different rollups,
yes,
right, then he can of course give you a pre-confirmation that I do this here and this here, right? You can hit that in one.
Yeah, he's guaranteeing inclusion but not execution. And inclusion by itself isn't necessarily a superpower with that, because inclusion just says both rollups will see both transactions, but we do not know if both rollups will execute both transactions. You need a specialized either block builder, something like Javelin, or you need a proving solution like the Polygon AG layer to be able to have synchronous composability. Base sequencing by itself just provides essentially a mechanism to coordinate. You need some external solution on top of it to provide synchronous composability.
Right. I mean, I guess it's not a question, how strong your pre-conf is, right? You could also have, like, for example, at Primev, the pre-confirmations we built would also give you execution guarantees, right? Now, of course, the question you can ask, okay, but who can actually give you these guarantees? Can like a dumb proposer do that? Right? And then it's a question like what infrastructure you need for this, right? But
yeah,
in principle, the technology would allow you to do that, right?
Yeah, you really just need execution pre-comps on both sides for it.
Exactly.
Yep.
I guess like maybe taking a step back and going back to, I guess, like the based sequencing, I think it's actually more interesting to consider based sequencing outside of like Ethereum, actually new ecosystems, different L1s, because they're faster, right? If you're using based sequencing, you're kind of limited to the performance characteristics of the L1 itself. So I think there's like interesting use cases. We haven't like really considered that type of architecture when we've been building our system, since we do have an L1 as well as multiple L2s. I still think like in general, applications themselves, they'll make the choice whether or not to use what type of sequencer based on like the economic benefits. And I think that's what we've kind of seen empirically. you probably want to capture the value. I do think there's value in shared sequencers in the sense that like there's probably some sort of regulatory risk, execution risk, and you're able to hedge some of that by using shared sequencers. But if you're looking at for like a pure, if you're like a rollup, right, and you're part of a set of interwoven rollups in some sense, and you do the most volume, or you generate the most value for your sequencer, would you really want to share with other people? Like maybe if you're a little bit altruistic and you're willing to go, split it with n rollups, or like n sequencers, that's fine. But a lot of these teams, right, like if we generate 80% of the volume or 80% of the fees or whatever, we probably want to capture all the fees that we generate.
Yeah, to end off here, I'd mention, I think what's super interesting is just that I think users want what's fast and cheap. Whatever L1 or like the base layer that provides that type of performance does also like impact what the slot times are. Hence, you guys are focusing on pre-configs. I think abstracting away all of these things, users and the next wave of developers that come in, they're going to want to see what's the most high performance solution, and what is a global ledger that is a global asset ledger that's performant enough for them. And I think that's why we're building what we're building at Termina, which is the first SVM cloud, because we're able to provide the high performant execution layer, as well as the customizability of utilizing the Solana stack. On the opposite side, you have this approach of preconfigs to increase the performance of what Ethereum and rollups and in sequencers can do. And so I think in many ways we are building the same thing. We're building something that's fast and cheap for end users.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I was able to learn something, so thanks for that, and I hope you had a good week.
Thanks.
Thank you for having us.